Hello everybody, this is a revision video which I intend to do for The Merchant of Venice, which I hope obviously will be helpful ahead of your mini assessments. So to start with here, there is a little activity which you can do just to sort of prompt your memories. If you want to pause the video now, you can do that. Assuming now that you've unpaused, I'll run through some of the key issues that arise from here. First of all, you'll notice that this is described as a history, therefore implying that even now by the year 1600 that you'll see at the bottom, so around 2 or 3 years after the play is being written, that there's already some confusion about how seriously or not to take it. More on that later. You'll notice, for example, in the sort of subtitle, a reference to the cruelty of Shylock the Jew, that cruelty which is not justified in any sense, but though it is focused on as if it were something self-contained in its own right, you might argue then that there's perhaps a certain lack of understanding of Shylock's motivation there. In the obtaining of Portia, you might want to think about the objectification of women that's described there, and the focus on this kind of conventional plot line of the sort of personality test of the three chests. The idea that is seen to be prominent enough to be described in this section. Otherwise, then you'll notice the fact that Shakespeare gets his name on the title page tells us enough about his status and popularity as a writer at the time that it's worth including. That's also echoed by the fact that it's described as having been acted at diverse times, i.e. several times, by the company that Shakespeare had a share in, the Lord Chamberlain's servants. So it's just a useful little opening then to think about that. In terms of the problem of genre, well, obviously we can, it's difficult to make generalizations about that, but for example, I think it's worth noting that first of all, it's worth noting that my screen is completely stuck. There we go, that's better. Right, so it's worth reminding ourselves there that within a couple of years after its publication in 1600, it's been described as a history, but within a decade of Shakespeare's death, the title page for the first folio refers to it as a comedy, and that, as we've said before, the kind of confusion, if you like, about to what extent we take it as being a comedic or a serious text, has very much dominated the debate about this text throughout its history. And of course, I think the answer really that we have to bear in mind is both. There are comedic elements, but often there is an underlying serious purpose, which we'll dwell on. So, in this then, briefly, what I'll run through, I'll quickly talk about the mark scheme as usual, a reminder of what that includes. We'll talk briefly about Shakespeare's possible purpose in the writing of the play. We'll focus at some length on different formal aspects, on significance of setting, briefly on Jewishness, a reminder about what is required for language analysis, and then finally some stuff on the different readings of the play. So that's what we'll carry through in this. So, first of all then, in terms of the mark scheme, now if you look at that top band there, which of course is crucially what we're all focusing on, you'll see the readings that you've covered many times before. It talks about this idea of a critical, exploratory, conceptualized response to the task and to the whole text. Judicious use of precise references to support interpretations. Now it covers that under A01. If you just jump down to A03 though, you'll notice again exploration of ideas, perspectives, contextual factors shown by specific detailed links between context, text and task. If we unpick those key words then, well, we talked about the idea of conceptualize, in other words, leading with key ideas, purposes. What is Shakespeare's purpose or design for this play? Starting with that, leading with that from your first sentence, but also linking to it throughout, which continues throughout. We've talked about the significance of judicious, precise references, clusters of short, sharp quotations. That obviously is the target, but sometimes you do need to quote at slightly more length, and don't be put off doing that if that's the best way to make a point. But always make sure, if you are going to quote at more length, that you have a lot to say about it. There's not really any point in making a lengthy quotation that you then can't analyse in depth. Talk about the writer's methods. It's worth worth mentioning that it must refer then to language, form, and structure. That I think is the kind of key thing. Um, Form, naturally, you're talking about that, by bringing in elements like kind of comedy. You're inevitably talking about that. Structure, again, if you're talking about things like characterization and contrasts and juxtapositions, you're inevitably talking about that. It's language that you have to work slightly harder to make sure that you integrate, and so we'll focus on that later. It talks about subject terminology used judiciously, i.e., frequent and precise use of terms. Again, for language, form, and structure, particularly making sure, I think, that language, I think, is that you're focusing on that as well as the other two is the key now to aiming to the top. Um, we've talked about this idea of the layered analysis, wider techniques like a simile, for example, then zooming into some key words like use of verbs or adjectives. All of my advice is, try and avoid things like nouns if possible. Think, well, does that noun have a symbolic significance, for example? Is it an epithet? It's a name that somebody's being called. Noun, I think, is very much the bottom of the pile as far as terms go, so try and think of it as a last resort only. Um, Effect on the reader is worth mentioning. Again, it needs to be detailed. Multiple interpretations can be good. Tentative language like modals, like could or may, can be helpful. Different readers sometimes is also useful, although not something that you should strain over. But for example, we today might see, for instance, the character of Shylock very differently in a kind of post-Nazi Germany, post-Holocaust world. We might see him very differently to a reader would have done in Shakespeare's time. Similarly with Portia, in a sort of post-feminist world, um, we perhaps see more liberally what Shakespeare might have been trying to do. A useful term to talk about, if we're talking about Shakespeare's intentions in that regard, is this idea of a proto-feminist, um, as in a sort of precursor to feminism. We can't really attribute to him these kind of ideas when it comes about 400 years before them, but undoubtedly he had relatively progressive views, I think, about the capacity and capability of women, which he explores in texts like this one. And finally, then, the idea of ideas and perspectives. Again, it's linking to purpose. It links back to the conceptual idea, but again, reference to that in the introduction and throughout. And whatever you're talking about, be it form, be it setting, whatever it might be, linking to purpose. Not merely what is it, not merely why is it, what is it suggesting, but why is it done? What is Shakespeare trying to suggest, or what does he seem to be trying to suggest? Right then, so let's think about his purpose in a little more detail. So first of all, everything, I think, really almost everything should be and can be linked to this, and be that discussion of form or setting or language use of anything else. It's something that you should return to periodically throughout. I would argue perhaps once a paragraph, might be a reasonable thing to do. Now, yes, since we can't obviously know Shakespeare's intentions for certain, and we can't ask him, we can only speculate about them, and so it's best to use that tentative language, things like the modals, when exploring this. This could be to, or Shakespeare's aim here might be to, or Shakespeare seems to be trying to, something like that. Is worth bearing in mind. And if you don't use tentative language, you end up making what look like potentially unfounded assertions. In other words, it looks like you're making these claims that we just can't justify. So that's where the tentative language comes in. It protects you because within reason, you can almost say anything under the guise of tentative language. You can make almost any claim. Um, Not that I'm advising you to, but it is possible. Um, Now, we can continue then with some more specific thoughts then about his potential intentions here. So things like power, the placing of power by society and the wrong people and the wrong groups. In this play, generally speaking, it lies with the Christians, for instance. It lies with the sort of patriarchal system and with these male characters, which in both cases Shakespeare shows them to be corrupt, to be hypocritical, to be at times violent, at times abusive, um, and very much exploitative of the power that they hold. So we can see it as being critical of that. If we take the kind of more feminized reading, or the feminist reading rather, then the idea of Portia is quite a radical character. Shakespeare using through her these comic conventions such as cross-dressing, for instance, um, to criticise the sort of patriarchal structure of Shakespeare's England and the kind of commodification and the objectification of women that we see there. Think back to that title page, the obtaining of Portia, for example. Clearly, then, editors of the text had very much focused on that aspect as well. Um, you can argue on a sort of similar vein, criticizing these kind of toxic aspects of masculinity and the hegemony that it holds, as I referred to with that first bullet point. You can think about it in terms of giving Shylock a voice, presenting him as a fully realized character in order to give voice to the disempowered, and also in contrast to those depictions of other similar characters as crude archetypes of race and religion rather than as human beings. There was a play a few years before this by Christopher Marlowe, who was a sort of um, um, early rival of Shakespeare in the first part of his career before his untimely death, called The Jew of Malta, which very much did focus on a character like that, a character called Barabbas, I believe. But he is presented as being strictly villainous, and clearly that's not what Shakespeare's doing here. Giving a voice to the oppressed very much seems to be something that he's thinking about. Criticising abuse and mistreatment, particularly from those in positions of power, and the impact that those things can have. Shylock, undoubtedly, towards the end of this play, becomes a character who is much more difficult to humanise and to sympathise with. And yet, as he says himself, the villainy you teach me I will execute. He only becomes that way because of the mistreatment that he has received. At the beginning of the play, what does he talk about? But he talks about how he has borne it with a patient shrug. For sufferance is the badge of all our tribe. This kind of early sort of fatalism and this early acceptance is destroyed by the abuse that he receives and by the mistreatment that he receives. So you can make that argument there quite strongly. Now, in its criticisms of Venice, you can also look into things like the criticism of superficiality and materialism, of society that values wealth and money and the appearance of them. And I think that's particularly strongly expressed actually in things like the casket scenes, because of course with the gold and the silver caskets you have that idea of criticism of judgment by outside value. And that, we can mock the casket test in a sense as being sort of crude and certainly anti-feminist in the sense that it seems to be denying Portia her right to free choice. And yet actually, if it has the capacity to protect her from men of that sort, we can certainly argue that it has a benevolent purpose. And in its criticism of those things, and arguably criticising the kind of patriarchy as well. And linking to that, the idea of criticising the kind of commercialism and that sort of very, very early sort of capitalism that Venice as a trading state very much echoed, and through its portrayal of the corruption that we see. So let's move on then and let's think about the kind of formal origins and the formal aspects of the play, beginning then first of all with the kind of medieval elements. Now, this is something that's very simple. It's very much something written, generally speaking, by the people for the people. The origins of much of the medieval comedy was written comes from the craft guilds. These organisations of people of one particular trade or profession coming together to write these plays, particularly for Easter or for other occasions. And of course, the example that we looked at, the Second Shepherd's Play, you have these kind of defining features like the sort of the kind of very broad humour, after all written for illiterate peasants, the idea of sheep disguised as babies and so on, and people recognising them as such. This idea that it's quite earthy, dealing with everyday life, kind of warts and all. The idea that in that play you have Mac, the feckless husband, the thief, stealing from the shepherds on their way to the birth of Jesus, and all that sort of thing. The lack of respect towards these sort of important topics, this idea that it can be quite subversive, quite critical of things like the absurdity and the hypocrisy of those in power. And relating stories, again, to contemporary real-world issues, so like exploitative employers, unhappy marriages, the struggles of poverty. And we see that here, how the biblical story of the wise men and or in this case, the shepherds being announced the birth of Jesus. We see how that is then kind of placed into the context of their everyday lives, the petty squabbles, the complaints about exploitative masters, and so on. Um, Again, actually quite subversive if you think about it. But that is some of its power. It's the use of comedy as a tool for social criticism, which I think is definitely an aspect that Shakespeare maintains. You might want to think then about what specific ways the merchant actually conforms to aspects of this tradition. Um, if you want to pause that, you may do so, but I'll continue on. So, thinking about then things like here, in terms of the broad humour, things like Lancelot and his father um, pretending that he is dead, for example, giving him the back of his head to feel so that he thinks he's grown a large beard. Um, Sort of, it's comic, but it also plays into a feature actually that the sort of subversive element, in the sense that it seems to be a kind of revolt of the young against the old. Um, Similarly, I suppose then you have things like Gratiano and the kind of crudeness that he expresses in various places, but particularly in the trial scene. And of course, in that particular case, you have the double irony that he is doing that in front of his disguised wife Nerissa, um, having pretended to be a much more respectable individual in order to win her over. He now, ironically and inadvertently, shows her his true colours. Um, you also have things like Lancelot's complaints about life with Shylock, for example, which again dealing with the sort of everyday life and the struggles that we mentioned. Portia talking about her problems as a woman. Again, we have this idea of the relationship between parents and children, between the young and the old. Portia struggling against the will of her dead father, Jessica against Shylock, for example. So these kind of aspects. Um, and also the idea that this play gives voice to and explores the status of women, the place of, as it were, minorities, if you like, the disempowered in society, the position of masters and men of different religions, Judaism and criticism. And if we extend that to be a kind of metaphor for wider issues, then we can take that to represent all kinds of social division. The idea that, yes, we can have quite a limited metaphor for, for um, for Christians versus Jews, read Catholics and Protestants, but more widely, any kind of divisions in society can be represented by it. So I think that a lot of these kind of satirical elements of the play we can read as coming from that medieval tradition. In Shakespeare's time, though, comedy starts to change really quite significantly, and I think it starts to really take much of that influence from the Renaissance Europe, and for that reason, it becomes a much more sophisticated genre. Um, so some of the key features here: happy ending, probably including marriage, or in this case, numerous marriages. Um, we can certainly see that. And if we take the view that Shylock's forced conversion is actually a mercy, in that it spares him from a Christian view of eternal damnation, that it prevents him from continuing his money lending work, which would also lead to damnation. If we take that view, then that can be seen as part of this play's happy ending. Now, obviously, for we as a modern audience, that is very problematic, but you can certainly see how that might have been read as such, or uh, understood as such by a Shakespearean audience. We've mentioned the greater sophistication and the more light-hearted tone and style. There is a lot, for example, of quite insignificant banter, as in, for example, that between people like Salerio and Salanio and Antonio in the very beginning. Um, there's quite a good example towards the end between Lorenzo and Jessica as well. Um, but much more of this kind of light-hearted, inconsequential sort of chat. In terms of the sophistication, things like, for example, the general sort of erudition or the education level of many of these characters is also demonstrated, such as through things like the classical allusions which are made. There's also an interesting juxtaposition between the classical allusions of the education of the Christians and, for example, the biblical allusions by Shylock, demonstrating, you might argue, his much greater seriousness um, uh, uh, through that educational, or rather religiously educational upbringing. Um, Now, we talked about things like the idea of a movement towards a green world or an idealized refuge, which is very much where the Belmont idea comes in. And that's something that Shakespeare really uses very strongly. We've talked about the idea of internal and external conflict, which I think, in all fairness, is something that really dominates many kinds of literature, but particularly the sort of internal angst of Antonio and Portia at the beginning, for example. Aspects like that do come into focus. Key in this, I think, is the sort of tension between the Apollonian and the Dionysian values, i.e., order and rationality on the one hand, chaos and emotion on the other hand, and again linked very much to the idea of the kind of Venice-Belmont juxtaposition, or the Venice-Belmont dichotomy, if you like. Emphasis on situation rather than character, well, possibly. I think the main characters are quite powerfully drawn. Some of the other ones, for example, I think are arguably a bit more superficial. They're more there again for their structural function rather than their particular quality as a rounded figure. So perhaps we can argue that. We've mentioned the idea of the struggle of young lovers, often opposed by elders, and this idea of kind of generational conflict, which again, I think, judging by the number of times Shakespeare returns to it in his plays, we can only conclude that in some ways the London of his time must have almost felt like, I don't know, for example, England in the 1960s or something like that, in that idea of a time when it seemed like everything was possible and revolution was just a matter of a course. That feeling of living through changing times, perhaps. Um, the idea of separation and reunification we see several times. Portia and Bassanio at the beginning, for example. Portia and Bassanio again later on. Antonio separated from Bassanio similarly. And of course, the key thing is the idea of reunification at the ending, linking very much to the happy ending that we see. And then ideas of deception and mistaken identity. Um, so all these comic features, clearly we can argue that Shakespeare uses them as part of his purposes, particularly things like the deception and the mistaken identity, the disguise. Clearly, in the case of Portia, for example, that's something that he uses very strongly, I think, Shakespeare, in order to demonstrate the full potentialities that she has as an educated woman and which otherwise would be denied to her. That's a prime example of how he takes the comic feature and makes a serious point from it. Um, and I'll dwell more on some of these things a little bit later. But you really do get a feeling, in the sense that Shakespeare, he does seem to sympathise rather more with the young in these conflicts. For example, the fact that Jessica in the end is rewarded for her escape from her father and her theft from him, rewarded with money, more of his money indeed, and a happy ending, and so on. Um, so, why then is comedy important? Now, I do think that you really do need to talk about how the use of comedy relates to Shakespeare's purpose. I think that's a key idea. And you have this idea of social satire, the idea that comedy can be used for social criticism. That, I think, is something that is quite strong here. You imitate in order to mock, and mock in order to criticize. Um, that, I think, we can argue without difficulty, for a number of different things. But there's also the element of protection from official sanction. If something is a comedy, then it has that superficial appearance of unseriousness. It's easier to argue that it is not, in fact, subversive or threatening, even though actually it very much can be. You have the idea of deniability, again, linking to that very much. And finally, there is this idea of the carnivalesque, this idea that actually in the comedic, in the unstructured, in the anarchic, you have this ability to show us things as they really are. You could argue that perhaps those kind of slightly chaotic elements of this play reveal more deep truths than something more serious would otherwise do. Um, that's the kind of key idea about the power of the carnivalesque and its capacity to reveal. Um, so, although this play has been described as a comedy, and I think overall, I think that has to be the best description of it, there are other elements that we need to bear in mind. Now, I think Shylock specifically can be seen very much here as having elements of the tragic hero. At times, he is allowed this idea of a seriousness and a dignity that belie historic performance aspects to present him as a sort of malevolent caricature of a Jewish figure, to present him, if you like, in the way that characters such as Marlowe's Jew are, in the Jew of Malta, are presented. But clearly, the writing, clearly aspects of that allow him to defy that. And look, for example, at the key speeches in blank verse that he is allowed, that again elevate him from simply being a low status figure and a comic figure like Lancelot Gobbo. Um, we do see him speak in prose the first time that we meet him, um, and yet very quickly within the same scene we see him making speeches in blank verse. So clearly, though Shakespeare is obviously not ignorant of the comic potentialities of the comic Jewish stereotype, equally he is determined to present him as rounded, as a human being with feelings, and as in the famous speech, hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, passions, and so on, as every bit the equal of Christians as a fellow human being. Um, so, yes, clearly there are elements of him as a serious character. And equally, you could see how, with the addition of a grotesquely comic accent and some extravagant hand gestures, for example, like extravagant mannerisms, you could see how even a dignified speech like that might be presented in a stereotypical way, and yet at the same time, the mere fact, one of its existence, one of the beautiful poetry of its writing, and two of the blank verse, I think, show us that Shakespeare's intention was to elevate Shylock, and for that reason, just as with other sort of disempowered characters in the play, to give them a voice, to give them status, and to give them some measure of respect. Now, yes, Shylock is corrupted, but this is explicitly presented as a consequence of the abuse that he has received. It's explicitly said by Shylock at the beginning that he bears it with a patient shrug, that he does not respond, and it's explicitly described in terms of things like being footed as you would a stranger cur, spat upon my Jewish gabardine. It's explicitly described the ways in which he's been abused, and of course the final straw that that seems to break his back is the elopement of Jessica. It is that loss of his daughter, his final living relative, of much of his money, the money which allows him to earn a living, of this ring, a gift from his presumably deceased wife. That is what is the final straw for Shylock. Um, and does he fixate on Antonio? Well, he does, undoubtedly, but Antonio is the one man over whom he has potential power due to the bond, and therefore I think that we can quite strongly argue that poor Antonio, in a sense, becomes a scapegoat. Not a completely undeserving one, because his abuse of Shylock is on record and undenied. In fact, far from denying it, he says that he is like to do so again. Um, so there is a sense that karmically Antonio does get a certain element of his comeuppance for what he has done, but he is in essence he is innocent of the crime that Shylock most seeks revenge for. Um, Now, the downfall of Shylock can be seen as tragic if we sort of take the view that he has lost everything, though many at the time would have seen it as merciful that he's allowed to convert to Christianity and be prevented from damning himself through further money lending because his money is taken from him. At the same time, um, um, we can very much sort of strongly take that. Although, of course, um, the fact that the fact that people would have seen it as merciful lends itself more to the kind of comic um, aspect. We have to bear in mind, I suppose, one other useful thing to think about in terms of comedy at this time is that the first purpose of a comedy is not explicitly to make us laugh. Tragedy, too, for example, would contain comic scenes, perhaps just as many as a play like The Merchant. So the fact of it being a comedy refers as much to those other features. If you think about it, actually, one of the things that wasn't mentioned in that Renaissance list there was, in fact, comic scenes. Ironically, it's not the main or priority as we might, as a modern reader, expect. Um, so, what else then? In terms of things like the hierarchy of forms used in the play, well, starting at the bottom, obviously you have the use of prose, blank verse, heroic couplets or rhyming couplets, um, and song. And it's also bearing in mind then that you've got the use of the soliloquy and the aside there. Now, to focus on these then first. So prose, well, obviously reserved for servants, those of lower status, often associated as those characters are with comic scenes. And for example, that's where someone like Lancelot Gobbo comes in. But at times it's also used for Portia, although not always. You might, for example, want to talk about the fact that when she first uses it in Act 1, Scene 2, when talking with Nerissa, one, her words are comic, and link that to all the subversive elements of a woman talking about men, talking about princes and dukes and other high status men in such a sort of scurrilous and controversial way. Um, you might argue then that Shakespeare is using the prose there to harness all these most subversive elements of comedy. We see it briefly with Shylock, but then for most of the play, it rises into blank verse, um, which then is the next thing on our list. Blank verse, very much this idea of the voice of gentility, reserved for characters of noble status, which in practice is most of the characters most of the time, and especially, for example, people like Portia when in public, when defending her public reputation, for example, things like that. You have some use of rhymes, not particularly frequent, but think about when and why. We talk about it as being used for moments of greater intensity. There's also the idea of it being used, a rhyming couplet, for scene endings, but sometimes also characters trying to signal endings. Characters trying to, it's used quite subversively by Shakespeare at times, for characters trying to bring things to an end, which then fails. And finally, in the use of song, obviously the symbolic association with Belmont in terms of the sort of harmony and music. Thinking about who appreciates it the most and who doesn't. Well, again, very much the characters in Belmont and associated with it. Shylock, interestingly, is the most anti-music character in the play, who is so appalled at the prospect of there being masks, of there being the carnival, that he instructs Jessica to shut up his house and so on. He is the one who talks about music as being the sound of when the bagpipe sings in the nose, and things like that. So it's interesting how that is then used to sort of signify the gulf between Venice and Belmont. And again, in terms of the in terms of when it's used, you have that very subtle use of it by Portia, who publicly has no other way to influence Bassanio's decision with the caskets other than by the use of music, by the use of the harmony that implies. And it's interesting, by the end of the play, under the influence of Belmont, as it were, under those Apollonian virtues of Portia, how many people are reformed. Shylock, arguably, is taught a lesson for his cruelty and saved for eternity. Bassanio, who begins the play as a sort of notorious rake, a man drowning in his own debts and his own extravagances, a man who at the end is almost carelessly, you might argue, throwing around offers of the money he has, which of course is Portia's own money. In the Ring episode, she teaches him how to finally know the value of money and not to give it away so carelessly. You might argue with Nerissa and Gratiano that she, having witnessed his very crude slurs and commentary and the epithets that he uses towards Shylock in the trial scene of Act 4, Scene 1, you might argue that under the influence of Belmont, he too is then being taught a lesson about what good behaviour of decency, modesty, and humility should look like. So, setting then, let's think about this. Now, first of all, you have the Italian setting in general. In Venice as a trading state, I think we can argue that there would be strong parallels seen between that and the London of the 1590s, the London of Shakespeare's lifetime, two international trading cities with ships and merchants coming and going from all parts of the world. That's the kind of parallel, that's why it's chosen, and again, um, you have this idea that it provides distance, this idea that any criticism of society can simply be denied because it appears to be referring to a foreign city. And yet, I think it's quite well for our purposes with these essays. We can certainly argue that satirizing England is very much part of his intent. But within that, then you have the juxtaposition of Venice and Belmont and what they represent. On the one hand, for Belmont, the Apollonian, feminine, rational, harmonious, peaceful, intelligent, educated, cultured, pastoral, all these key ideas that relate to it. Now, versus on the other hand, then for Venice, the sort of the Dionysian elements, the masculine, irrational, discordant, chaotic, violent, foolish, ignorant, urban, all of these qualities. And on the one hand, very much you can argue that the play is critical of the one and promotes the other. Now, I started off by thinking that this juxtaposition is essentially idealized, that there was no realistic point to this. And certainly, in terms of the play being a comedy, we can argue that a comedy can criticise without having the need to promote a solution that a more serious text might. But as with the best comedy, I do think there is ironically a grain of truth in it. It seems bizarre to us, but think about this. 10 years after the play was sort of written, you have the establishment of the Jamestown colony in America. 22 years later, you have the Mayflower Pilgrims. And of course, why do these people go to America? For a new world, a new life, a life of freedom from religious oppression and the societies of the old world of Europe that had not been kind to them. So, yes, this seems idealized to us, but actually, that fantasy of escaping from all these things really must be quite current for this play as it is. Just a thought that's worth bearing in mind. And to be fair, I think that those fantasies about escape from the urban life is something that continues to this day. And you might argue in a world of COVID, we've all, I'm sure, read or seen stories about how people are now meant to be leaving cities in their droves because they've suddenly discovered the joy of rural or at least kind of out of urban living. So in a sense, these urges, however much we might mock them, these urges continue today. Now, in terms of the position of the Jews in Europe, we all know the key things about this and about how Venice's attitude compared. Now, for the most part, the key point about this is obviously general mistreatment. In many cases, they were being expelled. In many cases, they were having land and goods confiscated. Now, by and large, Venice's attitude is much more welcoming, not least because they welcome the international networks and the finance that they bring. They relish their roles of moneylenders, which is something that most Christians would not do because there is a belief that the Bible forbids it. But although there was this qualified welcoming, then also, of course, there are more negative aspects as well. Let's not forget that Venice is the originator of the word ghetto or ghetto, which is the Venetian dialect word, the first ghetto in the world, and the first to be named as such, which is formed just to the north of the Grand Canal, and indeed can still be visited today. The fact that they were placed under curfew, the fact that they had to pay for their own guards at night to maintain that, the fact that they were more heavily taxed than Christian citizens, but overall, nonetheless, it was a relatively safe haven, protected by the rule of law and their role in the kind of trading system. But thinking about Shakespeare's treatment of Jewish characters in the play, well, in terms of how they are treated by other characters, that's interesting. Now, for the most part, and from most of the Christian characters, what we see is fundamentally abuse. We see it from Salerio and Salanio, for example, mocking Shylock by imitating him as he ran through the streets looking for Jessica after her disappearance. We see it obviously from Antonio. We see it from Gratiano in the trial scene. For the most part, abused very badly. Um, but as we've said, I think we have to argue that Shakespeare intends us to see these characters, more specifically through Shylock, um, in a much more sympathetic and a much more sensitive and a much more humane and rounded way. We've kind of covered that. Now, I think we can argue that Judaism in the play serves a sort of more metaphorical role in the sense that it can be argued to represent any disempowered group. That could be women, that could be a different religion, it could be, for example, the Puritans, beg your pardon, it could be the Catholics in England, whatever you might argue. Um, but we can certainly make that point. Um, I think the problems of genre with the play indicate that, um, again, the point that we've made many times before, this idea that Shylock himself is a key character, I think, in the sort of confusion about how to see and to interpret. Um, and as we've also seen, these problems, that begin potentially even during Shakespeare's lifetime and certainly very soon afterwards. Um, and it's arguably really only in the last perhaps 100 years, perhaps, that we've seen gradually more and more um, fully rounded portrayals of him return. But certainly, I think we can argue that that was a key purpose of Shakespeare. Um, and that leads really on to the last point here, this idea about the link to the treatment of characters from the other traditionally disempowered groups in the play, i.e. women, i.e. the poor, the servants, and so on. The idea that ultimately, in a sense, they're all given a voice. In those conversations with Nerissa, for example, Portia is given a voice that she would not otherwise perhaps have, and we see her authentic perspective. It's done more comically, but even with Lancelot Gobbo, for example, in the soliloquy that he has at the beginning of his scene with his father, he too is given a voice, and he is given the opportunity to complain about his life, to talk about his mistreatment. So ultimately, as I said, I think really this play does give a great deal of opportunity, if you like, to these characters to speak and to be heard. It can very much be read as a sort of plea for tolerance. Now, really onto the almost the final section here then, thinking about the importance of language analysis. Well, we've talked before, I mentioned it at the beginning of this presentation when I talked about the mark scheme, about how it is vital to integrate these terms into your essays. Now, at the highest level, this does need to include terms for language, form, and structure, and that includes really all of you. There is nobody who that does not include. There is nobody who cannot and should not be doing that. Now, form, obviously, we've talked about that a very great deal. The two aspects actually that I didn't mention, funnily enough, now I think about it, there were the use of aside and soliloquy. And the key point that we mentioned there was about how few characters are given these, and about how significant it is. We talked, for example, about the fact that Shylock is given a number of them, and again, that implies that implies, I think, Shakespeare's desire to humanize him, and also to allow the audience to sort of bond with him, if you like, more intimately than they do with some of the others. Portia, interestingly enough, has them. We mentioned Lancelot Gobbo in a comic context, having something similar. So it's interesting how often Shakespeare uses this to bond, allow an audience to bond with the characters whom you might least expect. So that's the significant thing there. But otherwise, in terms of structure, ideas like things like setting, juxtaposition, and characterization, i.e., the relationship between characters, so things like parallels, foils, facilitating characters, etc. Foreshadowing, that idea of kind of parodying, the idea that you might, for example, argue that the relationship between Jessica and Shylock perhaps parodies is a sort of more comic parallel or a more overtly comic parallel to that between Portia and her dead father. Reference things like mood and atmosphere and so on. So structure, again, I think is a relatively easy one to cover. But the most important for English literature, really, I think, in terms of terms, things like symbols, images, metaphors, similes, motifs, things like that. Anything that leads you on to talk about the significance, the deeper meaning of things. And this is significant because it's a good window to talk about the effect of any one of these terms. I think, and you might want to talk about the motif of music, for instance. or indeed anything else. The sort of motif of kind of superficiality, or the sort of theme of kind of appearance versus reality that is explored by the casket scenes, for example. Or structurally, in fact, even you might want to talk about the relationship between that casket scene and what that teaches us about the, if you like, anti-materialism, and the lesson that that has for Bassanio, which he learns, because of the changes that take place from him as a young man by the middle of the play. It links to the idea in which Belmont and its values, its Apollonian values, can be seen to educate the rest of the play. Now, in terms of this then, analysis in layers, as we've mentioned before, can be a good way to approach this. The idea that, for example, you might start with talking about, for example, a key metaphor or a key symbol or a key image, and then you might want to go down to talk about, for example, some particular adjectives or verbs, not sort of labour the point, but just in a few places to demonstrate that you have that aspect. So reference to other terms, particularly if you're talking about perhaps a cluster or picking out some keywords in a cluster. You might want to talk about some particular verbs or adjectives, for example. But as I said before, I would probably argue to avoid noun, which I think is very much near the bottom of the sort of hierarchy, if you like, of terms that you can use. Think about, is it a metaphor? Is it an image? Is it a symbol? Is it an epithet, a name? Is there anything else that you can use instead of noun? And if there's nothing else and it's interesting, then fine, use it. But do think if there's anything else you can use instead. And finally, sometimes, if you can, it can be very, very powerful to slip in something about the effect of key sounds, things like sibilants, plosives, and so on. That can also be very powerful at the highest level, but it needs to be a supplement to other language analysis. It can't really be a substitute, because on this level, you're zeroing in to such an extent that you have to have covered the kind of wider analysis of meaning first. So, this is an example, just to reiterate, of what exactly it is that I mean by that. And this comes from, it's an example that you've seen several times before, but it comes from a Christmas Carol essay that was written at Christmas this year. Which is very, very well written, uses excellent quotations, and both small and large, and in a sense is doing everything apart from the use of terms, because it's talking about meaning and purpose, but not through that. So if we have a read of this first, so as it says here, it's from the middle paragraph, but it says, this suggests that Dickens is using Fred as a mouthpiece to present his own opinions. He argues that people should see others in society as fellow passengers instead of another race of creatures. Here Dickens may be commenting on how the consensus in Britain at the time that the novella was written was that the poor and the rich were almost two different species, and is therefore being critical of the rich, who tended to see the working class as almost inhumane. Skipping the comment, to continue, Scrooge supports this view that when visited by the portly gentleman, Scrooge refers to the poor as idle, implying that they make the choice to be lazy and not work, so subsequently deserve to go to workhouses and prisons. When the portly gentlemen state that many would rather die than live in these establishments, Scrooge retorts, saying if they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Here Scrooge is repeating Thomas Malthus's view, and the paragraph continues, but there's enough here to make my point. Now, the comment I've said here is excellent analysis, but just link explicitly to terms, e.g. juxtaposition, metaphor, symbols, etc. The creatures reference is also a good opportunity to talk about Dickens' subversion of the Gothic, to explore the impact of industrialisation on society, and link to other parts, e.g. ignorance and want, the businessmen in the exchange, etc. Now, obviously, that doesn't directly relate to this play, but the skills are the same. So, let's look then at the one that we did together where we made that change. So, for example, there, when it talks about the fellow passengers, we slipped in that phrase using the metaphor. So straight away, that is adding in a term, it's ticking that AO2 box. You've got then juxtaposed to another race of creatures. So again, it's a structural term emphasizing that relationship. The analysis carries on perfectly fluently. When it says earlier or later on, Scrooge refers to the poor using the adjective idle, simply adding that phrase there, using the adjective, again, it just draws attention to the fact that you're aware of language. And you don't have to really necessarily add anything else, because it goes on to talk about what that suggests, implying that they make the choice to be lazy. That was already in the answer. But simply by integrating terms in this way allows you to build on those skills and to score marks for that assessment objective too. And then finally, at the end, when it talks about repeating Thomas Malthus's view, you can talk about the kind of the nature of the vocabulary, the Latinate vocabulary that is used there: decrease, surplus, population, the kind of clinical, scientific tone that is created. But that's just an example of how easy it is to do. And I think I would definitely build in time in the hour that you have for this. I would definitely build in time to look back and to identify. And there's nothing that says that you can't, for example, underline or highlight the terms that you've used. You know, if you want to use that as a means of sort of self-assessment, as a means to ascertain to what extent you have covered this, then definitely do so. And I think there's no reason whatsoever why a paragraph can't have half a dozen terms in it. Really is something that we need to focus on, I think. And that almost concludes it. The final thing, just to mention about different readings of the play. It's one of the things I think that makes this play so enduringly popular, that it supports different interpretations. From the feminist point of view, or as we've argued, that you might argue that Shakespeare is a sort of proto-feminist, but now we can think about it from a feminist point of view. The idea that it focuses on what it has to say about the position of women. From the Marxist point of view, focuses on the economic exploitation elements, the plight of the poor, the corruption of the rich, themes like that. And finally, from the sort of post-colonial element, focusing on the sort of treatment of religious and racial minorities. Now, any one of those readings would focus on different aspects of the play, different characters, different points. But what I think is so powerful about it is the fact that arguably the play does support all of these readings. Right, well, this has been a bit of a sort of whistle stop, sort of crash course through all the elements of the play. I really hope that it has been useful. I'd be very interested as well in any feedback. If there's anything that anybody would like to hear more of that they think I haven't covered here, I'd be very glad if you could drop me a line. So thank you very much indeed for your time and your attention, and goodbye and good luck.